In this video lesson, we'll discuss the collapse of Reconstruction, and we'll investigate the terms, actually two presidents that we'll discuss, Ulysses S. Grant and Rutherford B. Hayes. The Grant administration began with Grant being very popular, but unfortunately his presidency was plagued with several scandals that occurred during his second term. Democrats said that wealthy businessmen had too much influence on Grant, and they criticized him for that. He had to deal with the Panic of 1873, which was an economic depression in the United States. And the Democrats are actually going to gain a majority in Congress due to Grant's scandals and to the poor economy. The Democratic Party mainly aligned with the South. When they controlled Congress, they could repeal many federal controls over the southern states. During the election of 1876, there was a virtual tie for president, and so something called the Compromise of 1877 was constructed. Basically, it was an agreement between the Republicans and the Democrats that the Democrats would allow Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Republican, to become president as long as the federal troops would be pulled out of the South. So basically, this was a compromise, again, between the Democrats and the Republicans. And the thing that the Democrats wanted from the Republicans was they wanted them out of the South and out of Democratic control. So a new South will arise after the Compromise of 1877. The North will pull its Union troops out of the South and leave the Southern governments very much back to their own devices, and so they are in control of their own destinies again. During this time period, sharecropping becomes common. And sharecropping was basically a system of tenant farmers who were paid a share of their crop to cover rent and farm costs to a landowner. So they didn't actually own their own land. They rented it or they leased it from a larger, wealthier landowner. There were also furnishing merchants who supplied the sharecroppers with equipment on credit, and they would take their crops if they couldn't pay. So these merchants took advantage of the newly freed men. They kind of did it under the guise of providing them with equipment, even though the newly freed men did not have money to actually purchase it or rent it. But then a lot of times, if the newly freed men did not make as much money as they had anticipated, they would take their crops from them if they were not paid back. So most of the former slaves ended up being sharecroppers, and this system is actually giving them a very near slavery status during the time period. So the furnishing merchant basically loans tools and seeds up to 60% interest, which is a lot, to the tenant farmer. Okay. Then the farmer also secures food, clothing, and other necessities on credit from the merchants. The merchant holds a lien or a mortgage on part of the tenant's future crops as repayment of debt. So now the tenant farmer, after doing that, plants their crops and harvests them in autumn. They turn over up to 1/2 of the crop to the landowner as payment or rent for the land. And the tenant gives the remainder of the crop to the merchant in payment of the debt. So basically, the issue is that the tenant farmers, the newly freed men, end up with very, very little, if any, profit. A lot of times they ended up continuing to be in debt. And so the landowner would then rent the land to the tenant farmer in exchange for 1/4 to 1/2 of the tenant farmer's future crop. So it basically was, oh, I'm sorry you didn't really make any money this year, but that's okay because I'm the landowner and I can lend you the money to get you through until next year, and then you can continue to owe me. But what that did is basically create a huge debt that the sharecroppers were not able to basically get out from under. And so they just continued to sink deeper into debt every year. This created what is called the cycle of poverty and prevented the newly freed men from being able to advance or better their lives. So the cycle of poverty basically starts in this way. Sharecroppers have a small plot of land and seed from the landowners that they're renting their land from. They buy their supplies on credit. They plant their crops. Then the sharecroppers give a portion of the harvest to the landowner. And then they sell what crop is left over for money, and the sharecroppers use their money to pay off their debts. But normally they did not make enough money to really pay off their debts. So only a few sharecroppers make enough money to become tenant farmers. And then the cycle starts all over again, most of the time with the tenant farmers or with the sharecroppers deeper in debt than they were the previous year. There was also a currency debate during this time period, whether to return to the American currency system to the gold standard or not to do that. And so we'll discuss a little bit more about that in class. There were some civil rights setbacks also as a result of Reconstruction, and especially when it came to the Supreme Court. There were court decisions that did not advance the cause of the newly freedmen. In the slaughterhouse cases, civil rights were ruled to state rather than to the federal rights, therefore leaving the newly freedmen more unprotected by the 14th Amendment. So basically the slaughterhouse cases said that the federal government had less control over this than individual states. In this court case, the 14th Amendment was ruled to not grant the federal government the right to punish whites who oppressed blacks. So basically it takes power away from the federal government to be able to protect the newly freedmen who were being oppressed in the South. And then in the U.S. versus Reese, the 15th Amendment was determined to not grant voting rights to anyone, but rather to restrict the types of voter discrimination. So it weakens the promise of the 15th Amendment with promising the right to vote to any male over the age of 21. So these were all setbacks in the Supreme Court that made it more difficult for the newly freedmen to make sure that their civil rights were protected. There was a period where the Southern Democrats wanted to redeem the South as well, and they wanted to take control back away from the Republicans, which is why they made the Compromise of 1877. They wanted to oust the Republicans out of the southern states, which they effectively are going to be doing as a result of that compromise. Southern Democrats actually wanted three things from the Compromise of 1877. They wanted the withdrawal of federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina. They wanted federal money to build a railroad from Texas to the west to be able to enhance trade. They wanted a conservative Southerner appointed to the cabinet. And this allowed the Southern Democrats to have what's called home rule, which is basically what they wanted as a result of the Compromise of 1877. They wanted control of their own governments again, and that is what they are going to be able to achieve through this compromise. So the legacy of Reconstruction can be argued, both sides really, whether it was a failure or whether it was a success. And there were failures in some respects and successes in others. Voter discrimination was not prohibited in the South, and the newly freedmen were oppressed, and that is clearly a failure. There was no land reform. There was a racial bias that becomes a national and not a regional problem, and that is clearly a failure. And the Supreme Court undermined the 14th and 15th Amendments and reduced the power to protect the newly freedmen, and that's clearly a failure as well. The successes were that African Americans began to participate in government. State government began solving social problems through the use of social programs. Churches, families, and schools were set up for African Americans and poor whites in the South. The breakup of the plantation system was clearly a success. And the passage alone of the 14th and 15th Amendments, even though their power was weakened to help as a result of the home rule of the Southerners, it was still a success that they were passed. And we'll discuss more about the legacy of Reconstruction and the successes and failures in our discussions in class.